This is a strange mix. You know, Jeff and Dennis and myself. First of all, let me say what an honor it is for me to be here. I've been long an admirer of both of these two gentlemen. I've known Jeff longer as a personal friend, and he's a hometown boy here as well, so thank you, Jeff, for being here to anchor this. But it was a few years ago for the first time that I started listening to Dennis Prager. And it was in a debate, the context of a debate in which I heard him come back at the famed English philosopher Jonathan Glover. That was the first time I read your response, Dennis, and was so profoundly moved. I've quoted you many times from that and many of your other debates. Your one with Sam Harris, too, was just masterful. I think what we have in Dennis Prager is a voice that's much needed for our times, insightful, incisive in his analysis. My wife and I had the privilege of meeting him formally for the first time a couple of years ago. And when he contacted us to do this event, I was more than honored and thrilled for the opportunity, because when we're talking about the death of truth and the decline of culture, none of us needs to actually substantiate it. We know very well. We are immersed in it and understand the ramifications well. Our job tonight is to try and give you the perspective from which I come to it as a Christian apologist, and Dennis will come to it as a talk show host, a Jewish philosopher. He's very well versed in world religions, understands those subjects extremely well. So let me begin with my minutes allotted here, and then after that, Dennis will be responding, and we'll go on in the program, a time of interaction for both of us, moderated by Jeff, and then an opportunity for you to ask questions at the end of the evening. Let me begin by quoting a man that I quote virtually in one form or the other in every talk I give, because he had a profound impact on my life. I had the privilege of meeting Malcolm Muggeridge just about 7 months before he died in his home in England. It was a dream come true for me. One of the things Muggeridge said in the 70s was this: "It is difficult to resist the conclusion that 20th century man has decided to abolish himself. Tired of the struggle to be himself, he has created boredom out of his own affluence, impotence out of his own erotomania, and vulnerability out of his own strength. He himself blows the trumpet that brings the walls of his own cities crashing down, until at last, having educated himself into imbecility, having drugged and polluted himself into stupefaction, he keels over a weary, battered old brontosaurus and becomes extinct." That's over 40 years ago. How he's created boredom out of his own affluence, impotence out of his erotomania, vulnerability out of his strength. He blows the trumpet that brings the walls of his own cities crashing down. And that winning line of all, having educated himself into imbecility. Because the fact is that there is nothing so vulgar left in our human experience for which you cannot find some professor from somewhere to justify it. That's precisely what has happened. Now, what came of this? Two very remarkable implications. These may not necessarily be the unintended consequences, but they are the direct consequences of the choices that were made in the latter part of the last century, beginning from the 60s in the so-called Cultural Revolution. The first thing that happened was the death of truth. The death of truth. I recall some years ago when I was doing my studies at Cambridge, my wife, my children, and I were attending a trial in progress at the Old Bailey. You go into one of the upper galleries and you can pick any one of the trials that is going on. Unknown to us, it was two young girls, minors, who had charged a man with having raped them. You couldn't see the little girls because they were minors, but you could hear their voices, and they were about 12 or 14 or something. Barristers could see them on the screen. And I remember at the end of that, walking away with this one question, because both of the lawyers did an extraordinary job, but the man defending the person who was accused began his defense with this astounding statement. He said, "To you girls, I want to know one thing. I want you to know just one thing. I am not here to intimidate you. I'm not here to embarrass you. I'm not here to hurt you. I want only one thing from you. That is the truth. I just want the truth. If you don't know the answer to what I'm seeking, tell me that. But I don't want you to lie to any of the questions I'm raising. Only tell me the truth. If you can't remember, that's fine. I just want the truth. And then he moved into a very incredible line of questioning. And he said something like this. Now, supposedly this happened 2.5 months ago. Is that correct? They said, yes. Can you tell me why it took 2.5 months for you to finally talk to your parents about it? And the struggle with the answer, and all of us can understand if indeed it was traumatic. There are all kinds of extenuating circumstances. But then he said this. He said, is it true that on the day that you decided to talk to your mommy and daddy, both of you, this man saw you at such and such a place doing such and such a thing, and he said he was going to come and meet your mommy and daddy that night and tell them what he saw you up to that afternoon? Is that true? My daughter was there. My wife was there. By the time the questioning was unraveling out there, all of us walked away with one conclusion. We did not know what was the truth. Now, I just want to say this to you, ladies and gentlemen. If in one case where a rapacious act has been allegedly committed by an individual and the charge has been accordingly made, if in that one case it is imperative that we know the truth, because if it is true, justice needs to do its work with this man. If it is a false allegation, then something has to be done for justice also in dealing with the two young women who were seeking, for whatever reason then, to deal with his life. In one court case, it was critical we knew the truth. How about life itself in its origin, meaning, morality, and destiny? How did we come to the truth? If you move back to the 1500s, they talked of rationalism, where the indubitable certainty of mathematical and scientific statements, which almost became tautological in math. But rationalism became that finger of truth, in grabbing of which they thought they'd be grabbing all of the fist of reality. Rationalism gave way to empiricism. The scientific method became front and center. But in empiricism, the heart, the soul, and the feelings were lost. Existentialism emerged in the 19th and 20th century. From rationalism to empiricism to existentialism, and finally we came into postmodernism, which concluded there was no such thing as truth, no such thing as meaning, no such thing as certainty. And it is the postmodern worldview that is reigning sovereign over our academic institutions today. No truth, no meaning, no certainty. Amazing, the deconstruction that has taken place, even in literature, so that the author no longer reserves the right to explain himself or herself, but the subjectivist position of the reader to reinterpret whatever it is being said and recast the views of the writer. Two great consequences came from this, and I want to deal with that. For America, she as a nation decided then that there was no God. Friedrich Nietzsche talked about it in the latter part of the 1800s to 1900s. And if you really want no truth, no meaning, no certainty, how do you philosophically base it? They moved into the direction of a lie, and the first lie was that we are going to evict God from the public square. Will Durant said this: the greatest question of our time is not going to be communism versus capitalism, north versus south, east versus west. The greatest question of our time is going to be, can man live without God? And we as a nation, at least the media, the academic scholars and so on, have moved in the direction of trying to lead this nation apart from any transcendent framework. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, seeing this turn taking place, came to Harvard, spoke in our prestigious universities. Malcolm Muggeridge personally told me that the most painful experience he ever had was when he lectured at Harvard and many of the students booed him for what he was warning them about. Here are a couple of things Solzhenitsyn said. He said, when I was a little boy, I used to run around our home late at night while my grandfather would be talking to our family. The lights were dim, and I couldn't hear everything that would be said as I was never in the same room the whole time. But every now and then I would hear my grandfather's somber tones getting very intense, and it would always end with the same line. At the end of the night, he would say, do you know why this is happening to us as a nation? This is happening to us because we have forgotten God. Because we have forgotten God. Solzhenitsyn went on to say this, the West is on the verge of collapse, created by its own hands. Between good and evil, there is an irreconcilable contradiction. One cannot build one's national life without regard for this distinction. We, the oppressed people of Russia, watch with anguish the tragic enfeeblement of Europe. We offer you the experience of our own suffering. We would like you to accept it without having to pay the monstrous price of death and slavery that we have paid. We want you to accept it without having to pay the monstrous price of death and slavery that we have paid. But we move on and on to recognize, A, that our belief in God is gradually being eroded and our belief in values going at the same time. Listen to Arthur Schlesinger's book review in the New York Times some years ago. The mystic prophets of the absolute cannot save us. Sustained by our history in America and our traditions, we must save ourselves at whatever risk of heresy or blasphemy. We can find solace in the memorable representation of the human struggle against the absolute in the finest scene in the greatest of American novels. I refer, of course, to the scene when Huckleberry Finn decides that the plain hand of Providence requires him to tell Miss Watson where her runaway slave is Jim is to be found. Huck writes his letter of betrayal to Miss Watson, feels all washed and clean of sin for the first time I'd ever felt so in my life, and I knowed I could pray now. He sits there for a while thinking how good it was all this happened so, and how near I come to being lost and going to hell. But then Huck begins to think about Jim and the rush of the great river and the talking and the singing and the laughing and the friendship. Then I happened to look around and I seized that paper. I took it up and I held it in my hand. I was trembling because I had to decide forever betwixt two things, and I knowed it. I studied it a minute, sort of holding my breath, and then I said to myself, all right then, I'll go to hell, and tore it up. Schlesinger says, that, if I may say so, is what America is all about. He never paused to explain that the problem had come in the first place because of the forgotten absolute. But hitting at it with this kind of constructed argument is what our young people are given. Now I say to you this, what's happened? Very simply, when you do away with the absolute, when you do not know where to park it, of all places we ought not to have parked it, we have parked it precisely there. Now right and wrong is defined as being politically correct. If you ask an average person which is the one institution they distrust the most, it would probably be the political institution. And now our right and wrong is defined on either being politically correct or politically incorrect. And how do we solve it? We now call it tolerance, which is a fluid term at best. Let me wind this down and try to give you at least a hint at an answer here. You see, there are three kinds of cultures. A theonomous culture, where God's law is considered in the heart of people. It used to be something like natural law. Heteronymous culture, where a handful dictate to the masses. Iran is a heteronymous culture religiously. China is a heteronymous culture in secular terms. Theonomous, God's law is in the heart of humanity, and we live by that natural law. Heteronymous, where a handful from the top dictate to the many. America is neither of those now. So what do we call ourselves? An autonomous culture. Autos meaning self, nomos meaning law, which means we are a law unto ourselves individually. Fair enough. But when I speak at university campuses and I'm asked a deliberately leading question on my view on something, I tell them there's a theonomous culture, a heteronymous culture, and an autonomous culture. What kind of culture are we in? They'll always say autonomous. I said, all right, so you mean I'm given the privilege of a self-law, right? If I give you my view, will you accept it, or will you suddenly switch to an heteronymous stance and condemn me for giving my view on my opinion of right and wrong? Is this the bait and switch tactic? You know, one of the things I like about poetry, my work at Cambridge was in the romantic writers, Samuel Taylor Coleridge and others. But the modern poets will emulate them in their own way. And sometimes the rock musicians get it spot on. They get it spot on. You know why? They don't have to sound philosophically prosaic. They just have to tell it like it is. And so King Crimson puts it this way: cat's foot, iron claw, neurosurgeons scream for more, from paranoia's poison door, 21st century schizoid man. Blood rack, barbed wire, politicians, funeral pyre, innocents raped with napalm fire, 21st century schizoid man. Death seed, blind man's greed, poets starving, children bleed, nothing he's got he really needs, 21st century schizoid man. Now listen, the walls on which the prophets wrote is cracking at the seams. Upon the instruments of death the sunlight brightly gleams. Will no one lay the laurel wreath as silence drowns the screams? Between the iron gates of fate the seeds of time are sown and watered by the deeds of those who know and who are known. Knowledge is a deadly friend when no one sets the rules. The fate of all mankind, I see, is in the hands of fools. Confusion will be my epitaph as I crawl a cracked and broken path. If we make it, we can all sit back and laugh, but I'm afraid tomorrow I'll be crying. You see, you go back to the book of Genesis, there's only one prohibition. Do not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Just one prohibition. Because the day you do that, you shall be as God, knowing good and evil. What does that mean? You'll begin to play God, defining good and evil. Now do you see the number of laws we need just for our health care program? And you get onto a plane, they tell you there's a smoke detector there. They don't tell you don't mess with it. They tell you don't touch, tamper, disable, or destroy. Why the 4 words? Because in a court of law, every one of them will die the death of 1,000 qualifications. So instead of saying don't mess with it, don't touch, tamper, disable, destroy. That's what's happened when truth dies. And what happens as a result? Very simple. Taking of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, has it occurred to us that today every tree is protected except that one? Why are Dennis and I here? We have a common starting point, we have a common goal. The common starting point, he believes as I do, we are all made in the image of God, the Imago Dei. What is the goal he has in his heart as I do in mine? I can give you a simple illustration, and with that I will close and bring him on. Dennis, a few years ago, I was writing a book on a series of conversations, and one of them was Jesus Talks to Hitler, the Lamb and the Führer. And I was in Jerusalem and meeting with a prominent Israeli scholar, Moisés Sharon, who has written a multiple volume set on every inscription in Arabic in the Middle East. I'd met him for the first time. He was very cordial, took me into his office and so on. And after we talked for a little while on the book I was writing, doing my research in the Holocaust Museum and so on, he leaned forward and he said, Mr. Zacharias, you're a very clever man, but I'll tell you something you don't know. I said, Dr. Sharon, there's a lot I don't know. Please tell me. He said, before I became a professor, I worked for the Mossad. He said, I picked up broken bodies of suicide bombers. He said, so let me ask you this question. Your goal in life is to have communion with God, isn't it? I said, yes, sir. He said, so is mine. I want to have communion with God, and so is yours. He said, the men whose bodies I picked up on the streets blown up had a lead-like garment in the area that they wanted to protect so that they could use it in paradise. Now, that may not be the view that every one of them from that worldview holds to. He was just telling me about those who blew themselves up. He says, how do you talk to the person whose goal itself is purely material and sensual? He said, you and I can talk because our goal is the same, to someday find communion with God. And so I just say to you, it is a distinct honor to be here and present this gentleman to speak to you. And I want to close with one paragraph here from G.K. Chesterton that I think is fascinating. Nothing sublimely artistic has ever arisen out of mere art, any more than anything essentially reasonable has ever arisen out of pure reason. There must always be a rich moral soil for any great aesthetic growth. There must always be a rich moral soil for any great aesthetic growth. And Dr. Prager and I have that same burden to bring that moral soil back into our culture, because when truth is planted into a moral soil, it'll sprout and bring forth the right kind of fruit. And that's why our dialogue tonight. God bless you. Thank you.
It's not often, am I on? No. It's not often I feel anticlimactic. I just want, anticlimactic. I often feel anticlimactic, but especially anticlimactic change, but it's a very, very real honor for me. And those of you who know me from radio know I don't say things that I don't mean. And your presence here and to be with Ravi Zacharias, I want to tell you a story. And I know it's going to embarrass him, but it shouldn't embarrass him. It is about his humility, which I discovered in a very, very real way. And the story's never been told, but so it'll enter the legends of Ravi Zacharias. But I want to say a word about humility before I actually tell the story, because it's a very important thing. There's a line in the Bible, as we Jews call the Torah, the first 5 books. It says, and Moses was the most humble man in the world. And this is considered to be the 5 books of Moses. So the obvious question is, okay, I don't have to ask the obvious question since you know what it is. So I would like to say that I have no problem with Moses having written that he is the humblest man in the world. And I want to explain that. It's a very important insight, I believe. Now, of course, the tradition that I grew up in was Orthodox Judaism, and in the yeshiva world, which is immersion in the Jewish sources in the Hebrew. And I am still deeply religious and still believe the Torah is from God. I just happen not to be Orthodox, so I'm in no man's land. But that's a separate issue. I'm in every man's land and no man's land in terms of by Judaism. If they ask me, are you Reformed, Conservative, or Orthodox? I always say Reservadox, and that starts with its own problem. But I was taught the tradition was, don't blame Moses for writing it. It was dictated by God. And so he's just a stenographer and he's writing it. And that's fine, but I never bought that. Humility it doesn't mean you don't know your worth. It doesn't mean can a humble person know he's humble? I think so. Why not? What is it, a shock? I mean, if you work at being a good musician, do you know you're a good musician? If you work at being a good artist, if you work at being a good anything, do you know when you've achieved it, at least to a certain degree? A religious person wants to be humble because we all know that we're no better than anybody else. Every one of us is in God's image. I through luck and work and luck and luck and luck and work and luck and luck, achieved X or Y. And this person who is cleaning the toilets at at Atlanta Airport is exactly like me before God. There's no issue. So you work at it. So I just want to say that in advance, because a lot of people think that humility, you can't acknowledge if you are, and I know he wouldn't acknowledge it, but I want to say this. This touched me deeply. I have cruises with listeners each year, or different parts of the world, and I've done this for 15 years. And I'm very blessed. A lot of people come. And I didn't even know that Ravi Zacharias and Mrs. Zacharias were on the cruise. He never told me. He came as just another cruiser. And when I found out that he had done that, I was, to use the vernacular, there was no biblical basis for this line, I was blown away. Ezekiel 12:7. I made that up. I just realized in front of this audience, half of them going, Ezekiel 12:7, he's totally wrong. I should have cited some other source. But that is the man that you know as this magnificent and magnetic, charismatic speaker on behalf of Christian virtues and morality and Christianity itself. But I just wanted you to know about the man from a very different perspective. So anyway, it's a very special evening. By the way, I will say one thing. Those of you who listen to my show regularly might know that one of my mottos is that I talk about everything in life except what? Anybody remember? Thank you. Poetry. Exactly. And here I am being totally outclassed. I mean, by a man who not only appreciates it, but can recite it so well. And I'm thinking, you know what, I could leave now. But it was very moving to me and very powerful. Ravi Zacharias mentioned is the word you used there moral soil? Is that? Yeah. I'd like to begin with a reaction to that phrase, moral soil. I use this very often in talking about what has happened with the death of God in Western life. And it's not original to me. And I read it first in a Jewish philosopher, Will Herberg. And Will Herberg himself said he got it from somebody else, but he didn't know from whom. But in Judaism, I just have to say why I'm so adamant about this. We're raised with a lot of laws, as you know. It's a religion of laws. And one of them is that you're not allowed to offer an idea without citing the source. It's considered thievery. So I was so raised with that I always cite, as you may have heard, even on this issue of the continuing resolution and the whole budget issue and the closing of the government, or at least part of the government, I keep saying the idea that I most like, I heard on Fox News from Governor Huckabee. So, because every time I say it, I cite that he's the source and I'm not. So it shows the power of drilling moral ideas into children early. Because it doesn't leave you. It's so important. When I heard it over and over, and I'll tell you the Hebrew phrase. I won't say it in Hebrew, but I'll tell it to you in English. I learned it in Hebrew, but it's so powerful. Okay, I have to do it because I have to translate. Whoever brings a word or a statement in the name of the person who said it, brings redemption to the world. It's an unbelievable statement when you think about it. Just for citing a source, you bring redemption to the world. And again, just like with the Moses phrase, because this is how we're taught in Jewish school, always ask why? Why? Why do you bring redemption to the world just for citing a source? Because you're interested more in truth than in ego. That's why. And that's right. If people were more interested in truth than in ego, we would bring redemption to the world. So I think, how can I possibly ever cite a source without saying it? I want to bring redemption to the world. That's how drilled in it is, and how powerful the idea that truth is so important. Now to this phrase about moral soil. Ethics without God is cut flower ethics, or are cut flower ethics. What does that mean? If you cut flowers from the soil that nurtured them, and somebody who knows nothing, a Martian, visits and looks at the flower looks fine, right? And the Martian will conclude, hey, this doesn't need soil. It could live on its own. But obviously we all know that these flowers cut from their soil will wither and die. Ethics cut from their religious soil wither and die. That's why it's called cut flower ethics, and the analogy and the metaphor are perfect. That's what happens. But the problem is, it doesn't happen, if it's a problem indeed, it's a philosophical problem, perhaps not an existential one, and that is that it doesn't happen overnight, or it doesn't happen in a week like it does to a flower. It takes generations. But within 1 or 2 generations, that's exactly what happens. Ethics cut from their religious soil. I get a kick out of it when I talk to people who say, you don't need God for ethics. That was the debate that you honored me by reading, apparently, from Oxford. And, that's the argument. You don't need God for ethics. Look, all these ethical atheists. So I talk about look, America, we have these great values. We don't need God. Where did they come from? Where did they come from? The Germanic tribes of Europe? No, let me tell you about the Germanic tribes of Europe. I was listening to the learning company, I believe, or teaching company, or both. I think they use both names. And a professor was giving a talk on the history of the Catholic Church. And he made a point. It's really the one thing I remember from all 32 lectures. It was a great course, but this one I knew I had to remember. The toughest group for the church to convert to Christianity were Germanic tribes. And he gave the reason. And he was no apologist, he was just a professor. He said, because the Germanic tribes thought it was ridiculous that the church said, thou shalt not murder is a commandment. They said, what are you, nuts? The strong kill the weak. That's the way it works. What kind of stupid idea is that? You don't kill people weaker than you. And what is the answer to that? There is no answer to that. There is no secular answer to it. That's why it drives me nuts. Of course there are secular, decent people. Of course there are religious bastards. Of course we know that. But please, let's be honest about philosophically, it can't exist. There is no secular answer to why not murder. They try and try. I've been on radio 31 years debating this. I know every answer they give. Well, I know I don't want to be killed. You think the Germanic tribesmen wanted to be killed? No. So his answer was, you're right, I don't want to be killed. That's why I kill. That makes absolute perfect sense. This notion, well, I don't want to be killed, therefore I don't kill, makes no sense whatsoever. Nobody would steal in America. There would be no thievery. I don't want to be stolen from. So what? So what? So I'll make sure I'm not stolen from. If there is no God who says, thou shalt not murder, murder is not wrong. This drives atheists crazy. It drives them. I just wrote my syndicated column 3 weeks ago, a response to Dawkins, the famous atheist evolutionary biologist in Britain. And the most interesting thing I will say, and it's not even humility, is not my piece. It's the reactions to my piece. Thousands and thousands of comments from angry, bitter atheists mocking the idea that if there isn't a God who says, thou shalt not murder, murder isn't wrong, and yet every honest atheist philosopher I have debated or read has acknowledged that. They still don't believe in God, and they say, look, you still have to come up with ethics, otherwise we will destroy ourselves. That's fine. But they acknowledge if there is no God, then there is no absolute, period. What says murder is wrong? DNA? Where's the gene for morality? Where's the moral? Where can I see it in a test tube? It doesn't exist. It's just taste. I like yellow, you like blue, I like murder, you like non-murder. That is all it is. It's taste. So yes, we live in the age of cut flower ethics. We live in another age as a result of the death of God. It's called what I call the age of feelings. And I will tell you again, I will give you where I learned this, and I learned everything. I have to give credit to where it's due. I learned it all, really. I've spent my life, in effect, universalizing the Jewish ideas that my yeshiva training gave me till the age of 18. Half-day Jewish studies in Hebrew and half-day secular studies in English. And you will love this story. It changed my life in 4th grade. The rabbi announced to the class, boys, it's time, and I'll use it the way he said it, time to daven mincha, which means it is time for the afternoon prayers. So I walked over to the rabbi. God blessed me with chutzpah. And I say blessed because you need it in life, but never a disrespectful chutzpah, just guts and nerve. And I walked over very politely, and I looked up and I said, Rabbi Fostag, I'm not in the mood. I'm not in the mood to daven mincha. And I tell you, if I could have a video, 5 videos of my childhood, one of them would be Rabbi Fostag's reaction. The man who's a rabbi from Eastern Europe, he knew English very well, but in his life he had never heard mood and daven mincha in the same sentence. So he thinks and he thinks, and he finally says, he looks up and he goes, Dennis Prager is not in the mood to daven mincha. So what? You have to understand it was life-changing. That I learned that neither the rabbi nor God gave a hoot about my mood, that I had to act independent of my mood. This shaped my life. It shaped my life. It shaped my message on the radio. It shaped the most controversial thing I ever wrote, which you could look up tonight, and I'm sure many husbands will, and that is when a woman is not in the mood. So all you women who laughed at me before are not laughing quite as hard now. But I'm serious. That is exactly Judaism's approach to this stuff. Mood schmood. That's it. You know, there are things you got to do in life, even if you're not in the mood. We live in the age of mood, the age of feelings. There are no directives. There is no commander. There are no commandments. How do you feel about it? That's all that determines how one acts. How do you feel? My older son was 3 years old, and some 6, 7, 8-year-old bully walked over to him in a park in LA where I live and just threw him down on the ground. And I wasn't there. This was told to me by his mom. And she said, I couldn't believe what happened next. The mother ran over to this boy and said, "Darling, what's troubling you?" And as I have often said, I never met this woman. I know nothing about this woman, but I am willing to bet a large sum of money on one thing, that she attended graduate school. To come up with such a stupid response. No, this is learned. This is learned behavior. This is not instinctual. Instinctual is to give the kid a rap. But you learn in graduate school that you have to analyze your child's mood. What's troubling your child? So the differences between the world that is God-centered and the world that is not is the difference between everything. As Ravi said so powerfully, whether there is meaning, whether there are any absolutes, whether there is truth, and more. Is there a commander? That's everything. Is there a commander? Or am I my own commander? Is my heart my director, or is there a God who is my director, who is infinitely more wise than my heart? That's what it's ultimately about. And that's why we have virtually everything in common. Of course, we don't have all theological beliefs in common, but that's not uncommon even among Christians. Protestants and Catholics don't have identical views. And obviously, many Christians don't even consider Mormons, who call themselves, of course, Latter-day Saints. And by the way, every Christian I know, even though they have great differences with Mormons theologically, knows what beautiful family lives Mormons have built and what contributions they have made to the country, and I acknowledge that. And the final analysis, God will determine all of those things from my view, but I do know this. There's one great teaching that I do believe, and with this I will conclude my response. If I had to summarize my religion, Judaism, while standing on one leg, and that the reason I say it that way is because it's a very famous story in the Talmud, which is the holiest book in Judaism after the Bible. And that book has a story of the two greatest rabbis of their age, about 400 AD, so what is that, 1,700 years ago? So a pagan came over to them and said, "Can you explain your religion while standing on one leg?" And one rabbi hit him with his cane. This is the story. One rabbi, and he was one of the two great rabbis. Shammai was his name. And he hit the guy away. What, are you kidding? I'm going to tell you all of Judaism while standing on one leg? Get the hell out of here. I mean, moral, I'm freshening it. And by the way, to the Talmud's credit, they reported this because nobody likes his response. No other rabbi thought this was admirable, but nevertheless, it's recorded. And he went to the other rabbi, Hillel, and he said, "Oh, that's easy. Yes. Do not do to others what you not want done to yourself. The rest is commentary. Now go and study." That was beautiful. The rest is commentary. In other words, what's everything? Everything is behavior. And I know that Jews and Christians can have a theological difference, but even in the final analysis for Christians, and I am blessed to know Christians well, and it is a blessing. So many Christians call my show and tell me how I've even brought them to Christianity. And they say, it's really something. I tell my friends, this Jew on the air brought me to church. And I am utterly delighted by that. It makes my day. But I need to tell you, what Christians have done for me is equal. The theologians that I have read, the commentaries on the Bible that I have read that have so touched me, that have been written by Christians, you have no idea. Only I know, really. You can only imagine, but I know what debt I owe to Christians for my own faith, just as Christians owe, in some cases, a debt for mine. But this is where Judaism has this great teaching. Behavior is everything. And Christians believe that. No, I know faith is everything, but but it's Christian belief that faith without works is dead. Right? That you say you believe, but you don't act as if you believe, then maybe you really don't believe. So the truth is, bottom line, non-theologically, in real life, we both agree behavior is still the determinant. God wants us to be good. What's so complex about that? And that's what animates me. And because I know if God doesn't want us to be good, we won't be good. Thanks very much.